Hello, I'm Julian McKenzie.
And I'm Tristan Damour.
Welcome to another edition of the Scrum Podcast. This is episode 85 of our show. We are back after another kind of mini hiatus. You may have listened to our previous episode, episode 84, where we discussed the fallout from the unfortunate death of George Floyd in Minnesota. So much has happened since his passing, not just in everyday life and the world that we live in now, but also in the sports world. But we're in a time now where both of those worlds, where we have the anti-racism protests, where we deal with coronavirus, and the sports world as it still struggles to return to normalcy, both of them constantly keep converging and colliding with one another. So unfortunately, if you're one of those people who want to, hear us stick to sports and, say, hey, I don't want to listen to a show about, politics and coronavirus, and I want sports to be used as an escape. I'm kind of sorry for you, man. This is not the show for that. We've been trying our absolute best to stay relevant with the times. I have a lot of thoughts, obviously, on a lot of the different topics we're going to talk about today. Tristan, we got to talk about these two big Canadian stories. I think these have been two of the biggest Canadian stories these past few days, involving Black personalities that are on TV. Hal Johnson. I don't know how a prominent body break was in your household, considering you did watch a lot of Francophone and French TV, but for people, especially in Anglo-Canada, obviously, especially in Anglo-Quebec for sure, I'm sure, Body Break with Hal Johnson and Joanne McLeod featured, and we learned in the past few days about how that show kind of came to be, and unfortunately there is a bit of a racism component to that. Kayla Gray from TSN, we featured her on our 30 Under 30 from a couple months ago, and she has been featured very prominently in the last few days for her tweets and her opinions, and for being unapologetically Black in the last few days. And I just have to say, personally, I have to commend her for that. So I really want to get in on those two personalities during this show. We're going to touch up on coronavirus and how teams are trying to get back to playing. And we may even talk about Colin Kaepernick as well. So there's a lot we need to touch up on. Of course, Tristan Damour, you've been very popular these last few weeks talking on a whole bunch of different podcasts and radio shows and such. So, of course, I know you've been keeping busy these past few weeks. I'll probably touch off on that by the end of the show. But we have a lot we need to get into, considering we haven't done a podcast in so long. And I promise I won't do a rant that will be like 30 minutes and dominate the whole show like last time.
No, go right ahead. If I think the last episode, if you haven't listened in, if you haven't tuned in for that episode, definitely do so, and definitely at least spend the first 30 minutes listening to what Julian had to say, to what you had to say, J-Mac. I think it was one of our very, very good, very it was one of the shows that, looking back at when we first started, I obviously, we would wish that conversations like this wouldn't have to go to that extent, but it was kind of why we wanted to start that show as well. I mean, we started doing media analysis, but we very quickly kind of added that component as well to it. The whole let's not stick to sports. We had that in mind when we started, and I feel like 2-3 years ago, if we saw all of what we did, we would be really happy with ourselves. I'll add a tiny bit because you completely nailed it. There is a thing, and if you've been a Scrum listener for a little while, you'll completely get where I'm going at. The two solitudes concept.
Hmm.
which I did not know about Body Break. As growing up watching French television or like Quebec French language television, I didn't spend that much time on TSN, but I think, and I'll give it back right back at you there. I don't know where you wanted to start this first. I don't know if you wanted to go the Kayla Gray or the Al Johnson route, but I think, and we'll talk about it, later. Is I think one of the great examples of systemic racism in Canada, and using sports and sports media, which I think is like the most Scrum thing, the most Scrum analysis we can do of that reality, and saying that, especially for myself in the French Quebec side of things, where people say that systemic racism does not exist in the province, that's a pretty good example of it. So
Hmm.
I'll
Yeah.
pass the
See,
ball right back at you, J Mac.
I see. No one can see it because obviously we're an audio show, but I'm kind of miming myself catching the ball, receiving it from Tristan. But yeah, I wasn't sure if you knew anything about Body Break, because Body Break was a show that, just thinking about like when I was growing up, either on CTV or CPC or wherever, you would just be watching any old show, and where you'd expect to see commercials, it would kind of be inserted where these two people, Hal Johnson and Joanne McLeod, would do some kind of exercise or give you some kind of tip on how to eat healthy or live, well, right? And I mean, it's not to say, yeah, I didn't think so much of it when I was a kid. I just thought, okay, it's just some show that's on Canadian TV. And this week, Hal Johnson took to YouTube to talk about the origin story of Body Break and how ultimately racism played a factor. And he mentioned a few anecdotes leading up to its creation. And the one anecdote that shook me was when he went up to the bosses at TSN about the possibility of having a job. And as he explains it, he spoke with a director there, and I found it really interesting that he had mentioned specifically the time of day where he met with this person. He said around 11 o'clock in the morning, and it seemed as if he was going to have a job with TSN. And later on that afternoon, that same director came back to Hal and said that they could not offer him a job because they already have enough black people on staff. And I think they had one other black reporter, and I believe it was Mark Jones, who now works for ESPN and as a play-by-play guy, and his brother Paul is a play-by-play guy for the Raptors at Sportsnet now. So hearing that was really shocking to me. I know that we make light of, well, maybe not make light, but we point out how white so many newsrooms are in the present day. So it's not surprising at all in the 80s to hear that it was definitely the same case back then. But to hear a specific story where a person of color goes to a company to get a job, gets told they could have the job, and then they get overruled not long after, that shook me as a black reporter in this country, a sports personality, if you will, trying to rise up the ranks, knowing that a company which I have done work for on the radio side, I am aspiring to do work for them on the TV side, unfortunately has this dark past. So much so, I think a lot of people were really shaken by it. TSN eventually released a statement apologizing for what happened. And yeah, I was shook by it. I was really surprised by it. And I'm happy TSN released an apology over it. But it's really hard to shake. It's really tough. And I don't know if we look at it differently considering everything that's been going on with Kayla Gray over the past few days, and we'll get to that in a second. But we hear all these stories of all these different persons of color who try to get into the field of journalism. And because of their economic status in some cases, or just straight up racism from their compatriots, they ultimately get discouraged out of the field. And for a guy like Hal Johnson to go through what he did, and I mentioned there's other anecdotes that he had mentioned in his YouTube video, for him to still find a way to come up with a concept and put it out to TV and still see success off of it, it's a huge, huge. That's huge for Hal Johnson. That's amazing for him, and it's comforting for people like me to see that that can still happen in the face of adversity. But the story of Hal Johnson could have easily just been a sad one where someone may have ultimately been discouraged and turned around and said, you know what, this field is not for me. I'm going to have to do something else. And I wonder for how many other people who may have possibly been in Hal Johnson's shoes, how much has that happened to them? And are they in a completely different field now? Were they discouraged by it? I have to think there are enough people in this world, or in this country specifically, let alone stories we may hear in the United States, in this country, in Canada, where people go out of their way to say systemic racism is not a thing. Oh, and they pat themselves on the back for how racism is not the same as it is in America. There are definitely enough stories in this country of persons of color trying to get opportunities, trying to get ahead, but ultimately, through racism, they cannot advance so far.
I think you gave me the perfect segue for what I was gonna bring up, and I think one of the most I guess eye-opening quotes for me from that video was when he mentioned that a TSN executive told him, we don't think that we don't think that the Canadian public is ready for a black and white couple together. Mm-hmm. And so that to me is the perfect example, and it's probably what I'm going to bring up when people talk to me about that, or want to engage in that debate about how there isn't systemic racism. And like this is the system saying that the greater population of Canada, because TSN is a national broadcaster, taking the decision that the Canadian public is not ready to see a black man train on TV with a white woman. And then to bring it up and to even say, well, okay, it's not the same in Canada, blah, 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 blah. I think it's even worse when they came back and suggested to change Hal Johnson for a white guy and say, okay, well, we'll take it if you don't do it. That to me is the crux of it, because it's the whole you see that a lot in comedy as well, where they're like, oh, we already have one black comedian, we already have one woman comedian, we checked the box, it's good, we don't need more, as if you had another, in this case, black journalist or black comedian, they would do the exact same thing, which is such a stupid thing to think about, because there are so many white journalists and they don't necessarily talk about the same things over and over again. Why? Because they're not white, or because they're not guys, they would talk about the same things over and over again. Why on one side do we pride ourselves and say, oh, well, we don't have as blatant racism than in the US. It's not the same. We shouldn't talk about it the same way. But at the same time, you look around and this guy is being told that he can't be on TV because he's black, and they already have one black guy.
A lot of people are very uncomfortable discussing race in general. And a lot of people, especially in this country, are unreasonably uncomfortable with people who do not look like them. We happen to live in a city where we can go outside, obviously keeping distance from people, but we can go outside and see a wide variety of races and ethnicities and just people in general. So when you see people show up and have these racist ideologies about how, oh, you're not white, so you're inferior to me, it's very surprising. And but the reality is, there are so many parts of Canada where it's very there's just kind of one type of people who are there. So a lot of those people have no clue how like a black guy should be or what they look like. And all of a sudden they think like, oh man, like seeing a black guy on TV, like, whoa, it's so stupid. It's so stupid that people have been engineered to think that way. And it got so much to a point where program directors or people in positions of management all of a sudden just feel, you know what, I'm not sure if people in Canada are ready to have, you know, mixed races be on TV with each other. That's why I make it a huge point that, you know, we make a big deal about wanting to see Canadians, black Canadians who look like me and look like Avery McDougall out in Western Canada. Shout out to the boy. Salim Valji as well. People who don't look like white guys. Obviously, we make a big deal about having them on screen. But the next step after that, we need more people who can be in positions of management, who could be in positions of showing what Canadians should be seeing. Because then, I mean, I know we're far years removed from whatever Hal Johnson went through, but we can ensure that we will never have people who will be like, I'm not sure we're ready to have white and black people mix on TV. And even if it was something that happened in the 80s, it's still very shocking and very surprising to me. And I don't know how we would look at it if it was a situation where it's just an isolated incident. But I think you have a point you wanted to finish, and I'll let you go with that. But that incident kind of made a situation that was already kind of ongoing at TSN with Kayla Gray a little like much worse. I mean, it was kind of a bad PR week for TSN, I think.
Oh, I didn't necessarily have a point that I want to. I think it brings on I think it's a dumb vicious circle of saying, well, the Canadian public isn't ready to see more a more diverse a wider array of people on screen because they haven't seen a wide array of people on screen, and then we don't have more people, a more diverse broadcast crew because it's like it goes around and around, and you just like if you go by that standard, then you'll never have everybody's gonna be white because we're not ready, so we don't have them, and then we don't have them because they're not ready, and yet there are, and we know you shouted two of them out. We have very talented people. Let's just put sports broadcasting. Like there are a wide array of people that could do the job, but
they're out
because some guys in the corner office decide that, okay, let's go with whatever because it's a safer bet. Like it to me makes no sense because if we're going to say that it's not the same in Canada and hockey brings people together or whatever, soccer brings people together, it's got to be shown in the people that broadcast it too.
Mm-hmm.
There are people that are not white that like to talk about sports. I guarantee that.
Absolutely. And
that's good.
En tout cas, that should be the name of a spin-off podcast from the Scrum podcast. En tout cas, avec Tristan d'Amour. It's the alternate podcast where we just speak in French the whole time.
Where we do like a French spin-off. Wow.
I mean, that's if we want to get really ambitious. So to talk more about TSN, you have the Hal Johnson thing that blows up. And TSN was already dealing with comments being directed towards Kayla Gray. It's a bit of a long story, and you kind of have to track back to an opinion piece that came out from Sherry Ford, who was on TSN for quite some time, who is married to Dwayne Ford, a former CFL player, now an analyst for CFL on TSN, who shared an article about seeing what her husband was enduring in terms of racism. And in the piece, Sherry writes the N word out. And Kayla, in response, was saying, you know what, it's not really cool that she should be writing out the N word. And then some random guy, Tim McClure, up until this point, we've seen his name around the Canadian press. Shout out to everyone at the Canadian press. Has him down as a motivational speaker, but like, who else? What else does this guy do? I don't know. I feel pretty comfortable kind of asking this question aloud because I don't know who this guy is. But this guy put out an open message to TSN and everybody and tried to basically bring down Kayla for trying to ask a very serious question. Like, why did Sherry Ford feel the need to write out the N-word? And Dwayne Ford has since kind of tweeted out in support of his wife with the piece, and he kind of put it on himself with the fact that the word was out there. It was his experience. And honestly, when I read the piece, I kind of took it as that. I didn't necessarily take it as like Sherry trying to be liberal with using the word, but I also understand that a lot of people do get triggered by the usage of that word, just period, and having it come from a white person, even if they're trying to use it in context of something else, it's not something that everyone can be with. So for Kayla Gray to go out there and make a point saying like, hey, don't go out there using the N-word, especially if you're in a position where you're not supposed to be saying it, totally fine. But for Tim McClure, whoever this guy is, to make a whole tweet thread calling out Kayla and just thinking that off of, his what lack of experience with racism period as a white person, thinking he could just kind of step to Kayla and be like, no, you're in the wrong, let this go. Like what are you doing? Like he's an idiot. I can say that. He's an idiot for what he did. But what ended up happening after, TSN put out a statement that I think a lot of people on Twitter did not think go hard. They didn't think it went hard enough. It didn't necessarily mention Kayla Gray by name. It kind of just went out to Tim, and it was not necessarily sufficient. And then since that statement, TSN has put out a better statement offering full support for Kayla Gray. And throughout these protests that have been going on across our world, in the United States, in Canada, in various countries, out in Europe, and even into Asia, pretty much all over the world, Kayla Gray has gone out of her way to ensure that the Black Lives Matter movement, just the fact that Black Lives Matter, period, that people still remember that every day, and everyone should remember this, and everyone should acknowledge this every single day. People will go out of their way and be like, oh, I don't know what's going on with this looting and rioting and whatever. Just know at the end of the day, Black lives matter. They don't matter more than anyone else. That's not the point. They just matter. But Kayla is stepping to the forefront and is trying to ensure that people remember that. And then just before we recorded today, I had watched this piece that she voiced asking, when is it okay to be black? And it's absolutely worth your time. We'll link it in the podcast in our description, so you will be able to watch it. And you can hear the emotion in her voice, just simply asking questions like, when is it okay for us as black people to be black? While also throwing in all the different reactions from athletes over some of the different situations that have gone on. And even from white players as well. She's mentioned a lot of the reactions from NHL players. Jonathan Toews is featured in the video with a conversation that he had with Kevin Weeks, which I think has been incredible. I think Jonathan Toews has really stood up and has done an admirable job trying to show that he is trying to understand and is talking to other people about this, as opposed to other athletes who have just simply put out a statement and just said, okay, I've wiped my hands clean of what's going on. But that's a whole other discussion. Um, I just think with what Kayla Gray has been doing, I think it's been very brave. It's been very admirable. I think a lot of other journalists across the country, they may see the situation and say, you know what, I have to keep my biases or whatever. Obviously, I know as a black person, my life matters, but I don't want to be in a position where I just want to just tweet about this whole thing, or I don't want to put myself out there like that. But I think the fact that Kayla's been doing that these past few days has been nothing short of amazing. So I think Kayla Gray deserves a lot of praise for how she's handled some of the various situations that have come her way in the past few weeks, Tim McClure notwithstanding. And with that, TSN, I hope, off of that going forward, they're able to move on and they're able to, progress favorably, because these past few days with how they've handled with the news of Hal Johnson and then Kayla Gray now, it's tough. It's tough if you are in TSN PR. And this is not me trying to show so much sympathy for them, say, hey, feel bad. But just considering what we do with this podcast, just looking at it, that is tough. But it's a situation they have to deal with, and it's a situation they have to rectify. And to Kayla Gray, keep tweeting, keep doing what you're doing, because it's huge for people like me. It's huge for a lot of up-and-coming black journalists who want to get into the field. You're turning into a huge inspiration for a ton of people.
Yeah, I don't think I can have a stronger cosign from what you just said. Starting with everything that Kayla has been doing for the past, I want to say now 3 weeks, maybe more. I think it goes without saying that why we had her at top 3 last year, and I think she's a very strong candidate to top the 30 under 30 this year. We're still gonna do that, by the way, folks. No, fear not. And to the idiot Tim McClure, this was the public equivalent of an annoying white person being obnoxious and telling everybody that they want to see their manager. And to be very honest, the whole part where he goes on and tags pretty much every single TSN employee that Kayla Gray's work with, and at the end goes, but I don't want her to be removed from her position. It's the most ridiculous thing, and it shows how it went to the point where TSN had to acknowledge that this whole stupidity of a thread that this kid wrote, for what reason? To be a white guy arguing about the use of the N-word? Are you kidding me? This is my personal opinion, but regardless of the number of black people telling you can use the N-word as a white person, you still should not use the N-word at any sense of the term. Whether it's quoting Biggie or just calling someone your boy or whatever. Mm-hmm. There are other words that you can use. You can be a better person. You should know better. That's just me. After that, whatever. But you go on your public platform, because this kid has thousands of followers, and you tag everybody, and regardless of if you want Kayla Gray to be removed or not, you are still threatening her livelihood. In a workplace or in a domain or whatever where there are not a lot of black women. How many black women do you know in Canada that are hosts of a national broadcast show? Not a lot.
But her her, Marcy. I mean, I guess Marcy Ian for whatever she does with the social or any various CTV programming. Those are the two I can really think of.
So, you know,
But I'll say
that
this
was
about Tim. Oh, you go ahead.
no, please.
No. I was just going to say, sadly, and I can say this because I've experienced this myself. Tim McClure is not the first, nor will he be the last white person who will try to explain or try to feel they know how a word that is or term that is demeaning and harmful to black people should be used. You know, that's that's all I'm going to say on that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yep, it's a shame, but I'm sure if you like I mentioned Avery again, I'm sure if you ask Salim, I'm sure if you ask John Nagala, who's been on this podcast before, I'm sure if you ask Donovan Bennett, who we've had on this podcast before, I'm sure if you ask Arpin Basu, I'm sure if you ask so many people who we've had as persons of color on this podcast before, just in sports media in general, they have had a Tim McClure in their lives who thought, hey, you know, you shouldn't be going at this person because of how they said this word. It's something that it's something that follows a lot of people. So anyway, not to give Tim McClure any more time than he's
But
been
to do give
allotted.
some shout outs, though, you can give
Yes.
shout outs to the other side of the language. Kevin Raphael, who we had on the
Kevin
show as
Raphael,
well.
bien sûr.
Andy
Mika Guerrier,
Mailly-Pressoir.
too. Yep,
Absolutely.
absolutely, man. Yeah, man. Hopefully we can have Kevin and Meeker as well, and a few other people on the show as well. I loved having Kevin on. I think Meeker would be a good guest too. Uh, I guess that's more just kind of, you know, maybe for future episodes, a talk for future episodes, but still, I love having journalists who look like me on the Scrum podcast to just discuss journalism, and if they're willing to share their experiences, all the better. But yeah, I don't want to talk about Tim McClure anymore. Race,
No.
we're gonna exactly. We're gonna keep talking about race at different points of this podcast, but this is the part of the show where I want to start talking about the coronavirus. So we all know it's a part of our lives. COVID-19. It's affecting sports. It's affecting a lot of people's livelihoods, of course. The one thing I just want to talk about with the coronavirus now, it's the leagues who are either in the midst or have pretty much already decided where their bubbles are going to be posted. And the NBA and Major League Soccer both have bubble sites in Florida. I believe in Orlando. I think both of them are actually planning to be in Orlando, if I recall correctly. And considering the number of cases that keep coming up in Florida, they keep matching and surpassing their all-time highs over the last few days. And the cases where you thought they were going down, they're trending upward. You think about the other leagues like the NHL, who they're still trying to figure out where they want to have their games. Major League Baseball doesn't even know what they're doing, as far as I'm concerned, with how they're going to go about a season. But could you imagine being in a situation where the NBA or the MLS they said they committed to having their games in these specific sites in a state where cases are coming up? It's just scary. And to see that different teams and different leagues are posting about how, okay, this person has tested positive for coronavirus and they're shutting their facilities down. If you're a sports fan at home and you're crossing your fingers hoping, hey, I hope we get sports back really soon, I'm not sure how the news of the last few days, Tampa Bay Lightning is a team in particular I'm thinking of that shut down its facilities. I'm not sure how some of the news we've been hearing about over the last few days is encouraging to think that, you know, we could feasibly have sports action in North America over the next few months. I mean, I'm sure the owners and leagues will find a way to have it, but I'm not particularly encouraged.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where the whole situation could change by the time this podcast comes out. I think it I I understand why Florida was picked, and it at the time it was picked, it didn't seem like the situation was as dire as it is right now,
Hmm.
and we might be in a situation where there is some sort of a waiting game going on, where some of the leagues are looking at each other, thinking about what they're going to do and what the next move can be, because at least just on the MLS side of things, uh, teams are going to be reporting to Orlando really soon. You know, some are talking days. I know in the Montreal Impact's case, it was the. Let me try that again. I know on the Montreal Impact's case, it was reported that now that there's an opportunity for them to train in Montreal, that they could potentially leave for Orlando later than scheduled. Again, solely because of player safety, and just the fact that a lot of them have families that they probably won't see for a while, or they definitely won't see for a while if the tournaments go down. And then again with the NBA, that's a whole other issue with the calls that have been going on with whether the player should go or should actually do it. And you can't really blame the players. On one side, you have a situation where there's a potentially deadly virus that is still going on, but on the other side, you have owners that don't want to lose a lot of money. So
Yep.
like, to me, I typically take the player sides regarding specifically regarding player safety, both on the health and on the financial side of things. Yes, they might not make the money that they would make if they decide not to go, and then again, there's also the specifically for the NBA, there's also the Black Lives Matter, I guess, events that I don't know what word to use, but that is also pressing there as well. So to me, I think regardless of what happens, rushing to make a restart, specifically in North America, is a tricky thing, and I'd rather see a delay than a bunch of players getting it and then going back to square one.
I'm with you there. And you think of how the owners are going about and the leagues are trying to go about coming back. I think the NHL, I think they put out they said in light of the Tampa Bay Lightning facility closing, it hasn't really deterred them from starting NHL play back. But if these cases keep coming up, and especially now to high profile players, I mean, we're seeing now, or at least it was reported from Steve Stevens from a couple of days ago, that Austin Matthews of the Toronto Maple Leafs may have tested positive for coronavirus. I don't know. I'm just concerned. I mean, I want sports back as much as the next guy for my own livelihood, my own well being, and all that. Tristan, I know you're in the same boat. But if it's at a point where the cases are just spiking back and it's not doing anyone any good, you know, it just makes sense to just delay everything. It really does. And I really think, I mean, I'm not sure what it would take for a league to straight up say, you know what, we can't do this anymore. Maybe I think a huge outbreak would have to happen. Obviously, that's not what I'm advocating for, but I don't know. Just seeing some of the numbers pop up in the United States over the last few days, I'm not encouraged by the fact that we could still see action for some of the various leagues. But then again, I could be wrong and I could be a little too cautious, I guess. and I'm not in a position where I'm trying to bring a league back necessarily. I mean, I obviously am on the side that would like to see any action back, but at the same time, I also think just if we're in a position where we're just seeing cases pop up all the time, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It just doesn't, and especially in terms of locations. If nothing else, the locations. I don't know if it's too late for the NBA or the MLS to reconsider, but finding other bubble cities that can accommodate those players, that can accommodate all those resources, all those teams, while also being in a place that does not have as many cases, that's at least a better alternative versus being in Florida, which we were talking about it with Sam Stejskal from a couple weeks. I asked him a couple weeks ago, like, why Florida? Why does that make sense? I get they have the space for it, but with the fact that they have had the cases they've had over the last few days, I don't know. I don't feel particularly encouraged.
Yeah, and I feel like there's going to be a lot of eyes on the NWSL that are, if all goes well, they're going to be the first league to restart. And they're going to be in Utah, and the tournament is starting on the 27th of June. So if that goes well, maybe the plan to move to I guess, less dense area. But then again, there are less teams in the NWSL than there are in most of the major leagues. So that maybe was an easier move in order to accommodate for that. But yeah, I think right now the Florida numbers have been scary. And personally, I don't know. A lot of people say that they're not necessarily too worried about it, but at the same because of the fact that they're not going to be specifically in Orlando, they're going to be, the ESPN Wild World of Sports complex is a little to the side of Orlando, but it's still the same. Like, they're the people that are working at those resorts or those the people that are going to make for the facility, the housekeeping, everything, they still are from Orlando. So there is still a scare there. And I don't know. I hope that right now it doesn't. I hope that the move right now isn't to go there at all costs. And I hope that there are conversations that we to this day don't know about behind the scenes as to if the location, because it was always going to be complicated to in the middle of a pandemic on some sort of a short notice to create, for MLS's case, it's a whole tournament that is going to, some of it's going to count for the season and then some of it is not. And then with the NBA, it's the continuation of the season plus the playoffs. And then with the NHL, it's going to be the playoffs as well. It takes a lot of time and effort to create that, specifically now that every team has to come to one place or several places. But I hope that the money factor and the fact that a lot of teams want to reduce the financial impacts by restarting. I hope that there's still some sort of an asterisk on that regarding the safety of the people that will make you that money, which is the players and the staff, because they're going to be the ones going to those places and potentially risking getting coronavirus.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know, man. It's just, I'd feel differently about this if we'd see numbers kind of trend downward. I know in some parts of Canada they have been, and I think that's probably a big reason why a lot of people are hoping that, for the NHL, strictly speaking anyway, they want some of those cities to be considered as hub cities. But in the States right now, I'm not sure how bad the second wave will be out there in different places, but I don't know. I give the NHL props for not committing to a city yet. And maybe it's not too late for the NBA and MLS to do the same. It's not too late. They still have some time, but I don't know. Maybe I'm not an owner. I'm not a commissioner. I don't know if I'll ever be outside of fantasy leagues. Anyway. There's one last thing I want to bring up before we get to the end of our show that we haven't really discussed. Obviously, since we've been away over the past few weeks, and there's one person's name who was featured prominently in light of all of the anti-racism protests. I'm sure I mentioned him during our last episode, and it's the name of Colin Kaepernick, the former San Francisco 49ers quarterback who started kneeling during national anthems throughout the 2016 NFL season, and it sparked some protests around the league. It sparked a lot of outrage, including from U.S. President Donald Trump. And now we're in a position, now we're seeing that the National Football League is going out of its way to say they were wrong with how they handled the situation. And Commissioner Roger Goodell is trying to encourage teams to consider signing Colin Kaepernick. And athletes and personalities, just regular people, some of them are going out of their way to acknowledge, hey, you know what? I was wrong for thinking this protest was not the right way to go about things, or just not, or realizing that they did not understand what he was going for 4 years ago. And while some of those people should be commended for seeing the light, I'm also frustrated at the fact that it took people so long to realize what he was fighting for and what he was trying to bring up. But that's a whole other story. I can't help but feel that, I'm not sure how teams are going to feel about Colin Kaepernick as a free agent, as he still is. I'm not sure how Colin Kaepernick feels about the possibility of wanting to still play at this moment in time. I'd imagine he still would. But I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks that he could be on an NFL roster before the end of the year. And I don't have any hunch on it. I don't have any inside sources. But I'm just really intrigued at certain dots that are popping up here. And maybe it doesn't mean much, but I'm really curious about Colin Kaepernick's future in the NFL. And for some reason, I just see it happening in LA. I see it happening in Los Angeles. I see it happening with the Los Angeles Chargers. They've been a team that has gone out, their head coach Anthony Lynn said that they'd be crazy not to have him for a workout. And they're going to have the Hard Knock show, which usually the NFL produces the show. It goes through all these. Well, actually, I don't know if it's the NFL that produces the show. I shouldn't say that. But it is the show that goes through an NFL team's training camp, and they put out all these great episodes on the team. That being said, it just makes perfect sense from a PR standpoint for the NFL, as they've been trying to positively spin out of what's been going on with the anti-racism protests across the United States and beyond, and showing themselves as an ally to Colin Kaepernick when many were hoping that they would be a detractor to his message. It makes sense for him to, one, be on a roster, and two, I think from their standpoint, I wonder how many people how many people in the NFL league office would love to see him in Los Angeles, especially for a franchise that doesn't get a lot of love from its fans and would likely help be positive to them. That being said, we're not sure what the situation will be like in terms of accommodating fans inside their stadium, but any positive news for the Chargers organization, I'm sure, considering the history with them over the last few years, would be good. And it could come from Colin Kaepernick. Oh, I think that my phone is ringing. Okay, it stopped, so we're good. You go ahead.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, at the very beginning, it starts with Colin Kaepernick and how he feels about going back to play. And then after that, if assuming that he does, and that that part of the situation is sorted, then yeah, I don't know what necessarily the word is. I feel like irony is probably not the right word to use, but the NFL having, or just from what we know, the efforts that they made to just not have him in there, which they had a great assist by Donald Trump on that, and then having him back as good PR is kind of like has a sour taste in my mouth a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
For at least for Colin's sake. But if he does come back and wants to come back, and despite all of this, I think it shows tremendous strength on his part. But yeah, I think that to take the PR route, I think the Chargers are probably the best place to go, because Hard Knocks has always been a really good documentary, and this, I at least from what I was seeing, that it was supposed to be the LA Rams, and then they decided to go, because it's the first time that they're going to focus on two teams, and it's about the Rams and the Chargers moving into that new stadium in LA, and then I think if you put Kaepernick in there, you're just gonna get so many eyeballs on this doc, so many more eyeballs than usual. So yeah, I think if there's a place to be in the NFL for Colin Kaepernick, it's absolutely the LA Chargers. He has a shot. I mean, Phillip Rivers isn't there anymore, and they didn't manage to get Tom Brady. I think if there's a place, it's surely that. However, it's, I don't know. You look at Roger Goodell apologizing and say that they're condoning racism, and you take a step back and you're like, this is the most like it felt like such an empty message. Mm-hmm. And now, because it's the right moment, you're going to include Colin Kaepernick back in the fold and really put all the cameras on him, because, and again, I think you said it perfectly, the Chargers, since they left San Diego, didn't have the popularity or the drive that the Rams had in LA. And now by bringing Colin Kaepernick in, you're going to have Chargers fans from across the U.S., from across the world, because he's on the team. You're going to have Colin Kaepernick
fans, period. You're going to have Colin Kaepernick
Absolutely.
fans, just, period, showing up. Not to cut in, but I think that almost supersedes the Chargers fans that are there. You're going to have people who are just fans of Colin Kaepernick, period, who are just all of a sudden going to want to watch LA Chargers football. But that also is dependent on whether or not they even want him to actually be on their team. And for all we know, maybe some team would only want to have him for a workout, or just to, have them in for training camp. I don't know. But I'm with you, man. I think that the NFL's messaging of showing that they're in support of Kaepernick and that they're saying Black Lives Matter, they've had some videos go out in support, and it's like, where was this 4 years ago? Where was this on so many other occasions? It rings hollow, unfortunately. And I hope for a lot of people who have seen these messages and who have seen through the NFL, through people like Kayla Gray and Hal Johnson and all the like, that in the past few weeks, obviously this was a big deal, but we're going to come up on some times where it's not going to feature as prominently in the news cycle, and it's not going to be on your news feed on Instagram or Twitter as much. But advocating for, racial equality is something that should be happening, regardless. And we shouldn't have to wait for the news cycle to dictate that. So, I don't know. I think there's just natural distrust, or at least I'm not necessarily warmly recognizing the National Football League's actions on how they handled this Kaepernick situation and how they've handled some of the tweets and reactions they've posted in the last few days. But if Kaepernick gets up on a roster, maybe that changes, maybe that doesn't. Because I think at the end of the day, it's still on some owner in the National Football League to say, hey, you know what, we want Colin. And even then, you could look at if they end up signing him as something that would be advantageous to them. I think regardless of how this goes, a lot of people who are really standing with Colin may still feel a little bit of a sour taste in their mouth, unfortunately.
Yeah, you look at the NFL and you're like, well, back when a lot of people were critical of Colin Kaepernick for quote unquote disrespecting the flag, the NFL was really like they really pushed themselves onto that side of the narrative. And now that enough people are being vocal about it, they're basically pulling a 180 and jumping to the other side of the narrative. So, like, it doesn't feel genuine to me. But now that you're on, you were mentioning advocating, and I think I don't know if we have enough time to talk about that, but I would be remiss if we didn't at least acknowledge the creation of the Hockey Diversity Alliance and also the Black Players Coalition of MLS, which are two independent. One's a coalition and one's an alliance. Created by black players in National Hockey League, in hockey, I should say, and in Major League Soccer. And I think that's one of the great things that we're seeing right now is independent voices that aren't attached to, an NHL or an MLS or an NWHL for the hockey side of things. I guess the hope would be to put more pressure onto these leagues and onto their league offices. I think that is a thing that we saw from at least both of these sides to bring in more diversity there, because as we know, I mean, in everything, it can go as far as talking about CBA stuff. When there's more diversity in positions of power, you tend to see a drop down.
You're right. I'm glad we're able to acknowledge both of those coalitions coming together in the past few weeks. I hope we're able to have more complete episodes of the Scrum podcast where we address at least one of them in some way. It would be great if we'd be able to speak to someone from those alliances to, get a sense of why those came about and, how important they are to have in this present day. But I think it's really huge that both the NHL and the MLS have these coalitions now through the players that have stepped up and said, hey, we're going to do this. I think it's great on their part to have this.
Yeah, I wasn't sure because like we're approaching the hour mark and I wasn't sure, but I definitely just did want to acknowledge that there were a lot of things that happened in the past 3 weeks, so it was tough to try and break in everything and also talk about the pandemic because it's still very much a thing that is happening in the world. So we try and make it like we're not definitely not talking about sports, but we also don't stick to it.
Anyway. I even think even after once things actually do get to normal, we're probably still not going to really stick to it. I don't know. This podcast.
Oh no,
it was funny. It's fun, and for sure. It's funny because when we said we were going to come back and join sports, the sports podcasting network, we anticipated that this podcast was going to change from our previous iteration. And it's changed in so many more ways than I anticipated. But it's been for the better. Even if we have had the little breaks in between our episode postings. That's not necessarily like a shot at anyone. That's just nature of the business, the nature of how busy we've been these last few weeks, or just personal things going on. It happens. But
Yeah,
man,
we're not in a normal time
no,
frame, so we'll
no.
get to normalcy. It's just it's a progression. We just need to find the best way of doing it.
Yeah. And we appreciate everyone who's been listening throughout the different platforms that we have this podcast on. And we have audio on YouTube now, which I think it's been pretty nice to see that we're reaching out on many more platforms, not just podcatchers, right? So thanks to everyone who's been following our episodes these past few weeks. And we're going to keep giving you more content. Thank you for listening to the Scrum Podcast. If you want to send us questions or share your stories, shoot us an email at thescrumpodcast@gmail.com.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at the Scrum Podcast, and us individually. I'm at Tristan Damour with an S at the end, and he is at JKA McKenzie, not Mac, Mech. I know we call him J Mac, but it's McKenzie.
It sounds like the way you say mech, it's like the French word, like hey, salut mec, like friend. So I wonder if anyone would like listen to this and will think like it's MEC. But anyway, that's just one of the dumb things I think about. If you're interested in sponsoring us or buying ad space on the show, shoot us an email at thescrumpodcast@gmail.com. We'll give you a quote. If you're selling shirts, maybe you have a restaurant that you're trying to get back up off the ground in light of what's been going on with the coronavirus. Anything, hit us up. Let's talk.
You can also support us by leaving a rating and a review on all of the podcatchers: Stitcher, Apple, Google. Share your stuff share the podcast on Spotify. Yeah, Spotify, on your like Instagram stories. I do that a lot. It's really fun. And just share the episode with a friend, any friend, all of your friends. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Cooper Richardson for letting us use his music as our intro. His SoundCloud link is in the description.
This show is produced and edited by Kevin Laramie, aka Producer Kevin, as part of the Sports Podcasting Network. You can find out about all of the great shows at sportspodcastingnetwork.com.
Tristan, do you want to plug any of the podcasts and shows you've been on these last few days? I know you've been really busy. You've been kind of out there, putting yourself out there. You created a fictional starting 11 for the Montreal Sports Buzz podcast. This is your time to shine. Your time to plug. Pull an Alex Perez, if you will.
Yeah. Shout out to Alex Perez. But yeah, shout out to the folks at MTL Sports Buzz. I don't do a lot of French language stuff. It's always nice to be doing stuff with in my native tongue. I think that's really cool. So he has a podcast. The host David Richard has a podcast called Flashback, where he basically goes through his guests' like passions in sport and memories in sport. And I got to do a starting 11. I got to shout out a bunch of hockey players that I like. Shout out to Joel Ward, CIS. I got to talk about swimming a little bit. I got to create my own soccer team, which was really cool. And then, shouts out to Mike Miller and the Premier podcast. I was on a few of his shows, and I think I'll be on one sometime this week. So stick around. There's a lot of women's soccer talk, which I'm always really excited to talk about. So yeah, that's the plugs for this time. You have any plugs?
For CTV News, I did a story on Nelson Mandela's visit to Montreal over the 30 years ago. It's not really a sports thing, but it's something I'm pretty proud of. So you can check that out on CTV Montreal's website. That's pretty much the latest thing I really have going on over these last few days, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I saw you were plugging all those things, so why not just plug one thing? at the end of our latest episode of the Scrum podcast. 85 episodes. We haven't talked about this in a while, but we are coming up on the centennial. We are coming up on episode 100. Woo. So we're about 15 episodes away from getting there.
If you have any ideas for what we should do for episode 100, definitely let us know. And maybe we should do more shameless plugs at the end of the show. In the words of Chris Smoove, why not let it fly?
Can we get maybe if we do that, we have to start putting in some of his signature sounds.
Oh my god!
If we start doing, you have like Chris. Could you imagine an episode where we talk to Chris Smoove just about stuff?
I would love to have Chris Smoove on the show.
That'd be hilarious.
I don't know if I would be as excited as when we had Kevin Raphael, because I was excited when we had Kevin Raphael. But I grew up watching this guy's videos on YouTube. Go watch Chris Smoove. If you're a fan of NBA 2K, I think the way he does his career modes and like he's got a catchphrase for everything. It's amazing.
Oh man, he's helped me get through this quarantine, even with his old videos, like where he wasn't even just playing 2K, he was playing like Call of Duty. Like he has old videos where he's playing Call of Duty that are like hilarious. But anyway, maybe down the line, maybe for episode 100, who knows? We'll have to see how that goes. But in the meantime, Tristan, it's always a pleasure to do these episodes with you. I look forward to when we do episode 86. Whenever that happens, but you can be sure to know we're going to have an episode 86 sometime soon. That was not the smoothest way for me to end that off, but, times are not as smooth.
Not as smooth. Stay safe, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed episode 80, was it 84, 85? Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. Regardless of the number, don't forget to go subscribe on the new feed. We'll be back sooner than taking a 3-week hiatus, and we'll hear you on next time.